My husband left me stranded at the hospital after major surgery to meet someone he'd been chatting with online in Italy. "You'll figure it out," he said, walking away with my car keys and credit cards while I was still groggy from anesthesia. 6 months later, a private jet landed at the regional airport with my new lawyer aboard, and by then I owned everything that used to be ours. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital Recovery Ward buzzed overhead as I drifted in and out of consciousness, my abdomen wrapped in surgical bandages from the emergency appendectomy that had saved my life just hours earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morphine made everything feel distant and dreamlike, but one thing cut through the haze with crystal clarity. My husband Austin wasn't there. I'd been rushed to the emergency room at 3 a.m. when what I thought was food poisoning turned into excruciating pain that doubled me over on our kitchen floor. Austin had driven me to the hospital, pacing the waiting room while surgeons removed my appendix before it could rupture completely. The last thing I remembered before going under was his hand squeezing mine as they wheeled me into the operating room. "Mrs. Richardson," the nurse said gently, checking my IV line. "How are you feeling?" "Where's my husband?" I managed to whisper, my throat raw from the breathing tube. She glanced around the empty room. "He stepped out a while ago. I'm sure he'll be back soon." But something in her expression told me she wasn't sure at all. The way her eyes avoided mine, the careful neutrality in her voice. It was the same tone people used when they knew something. You didn't. Something that would hurt. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, my fingers clumsy from the medication. 17 missed calls from my sister Dolores in Phoenix. 3 voicemails from my best friend Taylor. Nothing from Austin. The first voicemail from Dolores was frantic. "Gracie, honey, I just got your text about the surgery. I'm booking a flight right now. Call me as soon as you can." My text? I scrolled through my messages with growing confusion. There, sent from my phone at 4:47 a.m. while I was unconscious in surgery, was a message I'd never written. "Everything went fine. Austin is taking great care of me. Don't worry, won't need any help. We'll call in a few days when I'm feeling better." Hands trembled as I continued scrolling. Similar messages had been sent to Taylor, to my coworkers, to anyone who might have rushed to help me. All sent while I was under anesthesia. All in a tone that sounded nothing like my usual texting style. The second voicemail from Taylor was confused. "Gracie, your text seemed weird. You never say don't worry about anything. And since when do you call Austin by his full name in texts? Just checking that you're really okay." But it was Dolores's final voicemail that made my blood run cold. "Honey, I know you said not to worry, but something feels off. I tried calling Austin to check on you, and his phone went straight to an international voicemail message. International, Gracie. Why would his phone be set up for international calls if he's taking care of you in Denver?" Denver. We lived in Denver, Colorado. I was in a Denver hospital. So why was Austin's phone configured for international use? With shaking fingers, I opened our shared phone account app. The location services showed Austin's phone was no longer in Colorado. According to the GPS data, his last known location was Milan, Italy. Timestamp, 6:23 a.m., just 2 hours after my surgery had ended. The room started spinning, and not from the morphine. While I'd been fighting for my life on an operating table, my husband had been boarding a plane to Italy. I called his number with trembling fingers. It rang once before connecting to a voicemail message I'd never heard before. "Ciao! You've reached Austin. I'm exploring beautiful Italy for the next few weeks. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I return to the States. Arrivederci." The casual cheerfulness in his voice made me nauseous. Exploring beautiful Italy. For the next few weeks. Not handling a family emergency or we'll call back soon. Exploring. Like he was on vacation. My mind raced through the implications. Our joint bank account. He had full access. Our credit cards, all in his name with me as an authorized user. Our car, titled in his name only because he'd insisted it was simpler for insurance. Our house, purchased with his inheritance, as the down payment, my name added to the deed only after we married, but his name listed first. In my medicated state, I'd trusted completely. I'd let him handle our finances because he was better with numbers. I'd let him manage our major purchases because he was more experienced with contracts. Slowly, over our 3 years of marriage, I'd ceded control of nearly every aspect of our shared life, believing it showed trust and partnership. Now, alone in a hospital bed with surgical staples holding my abdomen together, I realized it had actually been preparation for abandonment. The nurse returned with my discharge paperwork. "Is someone coming to pick you up, honey? You can't drive. Yourself home after surgery." I stared at the papers, panic rising in my chest. How was I supposed to get home? Austin had driven me here in our only car. His car, technically. My name wasn't on the title or insurance. Even if I could find the keys, I was in no condition to drive. "My husband will be here soon," I lied, buying time to figure out what to do. But as the hours ticked by and Austin's phone continued going, straight to that cheerful Italian voicemail, the truth became unavoidable. He wasn't coming back soon. He might not be coming back at all. The discharge nurse, an older woman named Marjorie, finally sat down beside my bed with a concerned expression. "Honey, we need to get you home safely, but we can't release you without a responsible adult to drive you. Is there someone else you can call?" Through tears of humiliation and fear, I called my sister Dolores. She booked the first flight from Phoenix and arrived 6 hours later, her face a mixture of fury and heartbreak when she saw me alone in that hospital room. "Where the hell is Austin?" she demanded, and I had to explain that my husband had abandoned me for someone he'd met online, someone he'd apparently been planning to visit in Italy while I recovered from emergency surgery. As Dolores helped me into her rental car, I caught sight of my reflection in the passenger mirror. Pale, hollow-eyed, wearing the same clothes I'd arrived in because Austin had taken my purse and keys. I looked like what I was, a woman who had been discarded at her most vulnerable moment. But in that reflection, I also saw something else beginning to kindle. Not just hurt or betrayal, but a cold, calculating anger that would fuel everything that came next. Austin thought he'd left me broken and helpless. He had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Dolores stayed with me for a week, sleeping on our living room couch and watching me like a hawk for signs of infection or breakdown. During those long, painful days of recovery, she helped me piece together the woman I'd been before Austin, the woman I'd somehow lost along the way. "You used to be fierce," she said one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on my bed while I attempted to walk to the bathroom without wincing. "Remember when Dad tried to make you quit the debate team in high school because it wasn't ladylike? You threatened to run away and join the circus." I did remember. I'd been captain of the debate team, editor of the school newspaper, and had dreams of becoming an investigative journalist. After high school, I'd studied communications at the University of Colorado, specializing in media ethics and corporate transparency. My professors had praised my tenacity in research and my ability to uncover hidden information. But somewhere between graduating summa cum laude and meeting Austin at a Denver networking event 3 years ago, that fierce girl had gotten buried, under layers of compromise and accommodation. Austin had been charming that night, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, confidently discussing his work as a commercial real estate developer. He'd approached me at the bar where I was nursing a wine and checking emails from my job at a small investigative news website. "Journalism," he'd said, reading over my shoulder with casual intrusion I should have recognized as a red flag. That must be exhausting, always looking for problems that might not even exist. I'd laughed, thinking he was joking. But over the months that followed, he'd gradually made similar comments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My articles were so negative. My sources were unreliable. Troublemakers. My editor was clearly underpaying me because the outlet was failing. He wasn't wrong about the pay. Denver Spotlight paid barely enough to cover my studio apartment rent and student loans. So when Austin suggested I freelance for his real estate company instead, writing promotional materials and press releases, it seemed practical. The pay was 3 times what I'd been making. "You're so talented," he'd said, stroking my hair as we lay in bed after I'd quit the news site. "Why waste it on stories nobody wants to read? Help me build something positive instead." Within 6 months, I'd moved into his upscale apartment in Cherry Creek. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony at the Denver Botanic Gardens, with Austin handling all the planning because he wanted to surprise me and knew what I'd love. Looking back, I realized I'd been slowly edited out of my own life. Austin had opinions about my friends. Taylor was too dramatic. My college roommate was clearly jealous of our success. My mentor from the news site was bitter about her own failures. One by one, I'd seen them less frequently until our wedding guest list included mostly Austin's business associates and a handful of my family members. He'd also had opinions about my appearance. The professional blazers I'd worn to interviews were too masculine. My comfortable flats were unflattering. He'd gifted me a new wardrobe for my birthday, flowing dresses, delicate jewelry, heels that made walking quickly impossible. I'd accepted it as generosity rather than recognizing it as control. Even my work had been gradually redirected. Instead of writing hard-hitting pieces about corporate malfeasance, I was crafting glossy descriptions of luxury condominiums and commercial developments. My byline appeared on lifestyle articles about elegant living and sophisticated investing. The skills that had once exposed corruption were now being used to sell expensive real estate to wealthy clients. "I think the worst part," I told Dolores as she helped me change my surgical dressings, "is that I convinced myself I was happy, that I was being practical and mature by compromising." "You weren't compromising," she said firmly. "You were being systematically isolated and controlled. There's a difference." She was right. Austin had been methodical in separating me from anything that might give me independence or perspective. My high-earning freelance work was still work for hire with no benefits, no job security, and no professional network outside his business circle. Our social life revolved around his clients and colleagues. Even our hobbies had become couple, activities that he chose. Wine tastings with his business partners, gallery openings featuring artists whose work he wanted to invest in, charity galas that advanced his professional reputation. I'd thought I was building a life with someone. Instead, I'd been constructing a beautiful cage around myself, with Austin holding the only key. The most humiliating realization was financial. In my previous life, I'd been scrupulously independent. I'd paid my own bills, managed my own investments, built my own credit. But married life with Austin had gradually centralized everything under his control for simplicity. Our bank accounts were joint, but he handled all the transactions. Our credit cards were in his name with me as an authorized user for better rates. Our car lease was under his credit because his score was higher. Even our house, purchased a year into our marriage, had been bought with his inheritance money, making him the primary owner despite my name being added to the deed. I'd contributed to our household financially through my freelance work, but that money had gone into our accounts, which Austin managed. I'd never questioned it because I'd trusted him completely. I'd seen it as a sign of successful partnership rather than a systematic removal of my financial autonomy. Now, sitting in our bedroom with surgical staples in my abdomen and my husband somewhere in Italy with another woman, I faced the terrifying reality. I had no independent access to money, transportation, or even my own professional reputation. The freelance writing I'd been doing was all under Austin's company umbrella. My portfolio was filled with work that belonged to his business. My professional references were his colleagues. If I tried to leave or rebuild my career, I'd be starting from scratch with a 3-year gap in legitimate journalism experience. "We need to get you a lawyer," Dolores said on her last night in Denver. "This isn't just abandonment, Gracie. This is financial abuse. He's left you trapped." I nodded, but even that felt overwhelming. How do you find a lawyer when your husband controls the finances? How do you pay legal fees when you have no independent income? How do you fight someone who has systematically positioned himself to hold all the power? As Dolores packed for her flight back to Phoenix, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by papers, bank statements, insurance policies, property documents, credit card agreements. Everything was in Austin's name or under his control. I felt like an archaeological dig of my own life, uncovering layer after layer of dependence I'd somehow agreed to. But buried in that pile of documents, I found something that made my pulse quicken. A business license I'd forgotten about, filed 2 years ago when I'd briefly considered starting my own freelance writing consultancy. I'd never pursued it because Austin had convinced me it was unnecessary, but the paperwork was still valid. Under Colorado law, I had the legal right to conduct business under that license, and more importantly, I had the right to open my own business banking account. It wasn't much, but it was a thread I could pull. A place to start rebuilding from nothing. The fierce girl Dolores remembered was still in there somewhere, buried under 3 years of careful conditioning. But abandonment, it turned out, was excellent excavation. 3 days after Dolores left, I sat in my home office staring at the business license that had become my lifeline. Richardson Communications Consulting. I'd almost forgotten filing the paperwork during a brief moment of ambition 2 years ago, when Austin's constant control had first started to chafe. I'd mentioned the idea to him casually over dinner, explaining how I could leverage my journalism background to help businesses with crisis communications and media strategy. Austin had listened with what I'd interpreted as supportive interest, asking detailed questions about my business plan and potential client base. "It's a great idea in theory," he'd said finally, reaching across the table to take my hand. "But timing is everything in business. We're about to buy the house, I'm closing 3 major deals this quarter, and honestly, sweetheart, you've never run a business before. The learning curve could be brutal." He'd been so reasonable, so seemingly concerned about my success rather than dismissive of it. What if you get clients and then can't deliver? Or what if the stress affects your health? You've been working so hard on my projects already. I'd wanted to argue, but his points seemed valid. I had been working long hours on his real estate, marketing campaigns. We were about to make the biggest purchase of our lives together. And truthfully, the idea of managing clients, handling contracts, and building a business from scratch did feel overwhelming. "Maybe after we get settled in the house," I'd conceded. "When things are more stable." Austin had smiled and squeezed my hand. "Exactly. There's no rush. Your talent isn't going anywhere." But there had always been another reason to wait. Another of Austin's projects that needed my attention. Another major life event that required focus. Another logical argument for why later was smarter than now. Now, sitting alone in the Cherry Creek house that felt more like a museum than a home. I realized Austin had never intended for later to come. He'd been perfectly content having my skills available for his business while ensuring I never developed the independence that came with my own. The business license was still valid for another 18 months. I pulled out my laptop and began researching what I'd need to reactivate it. A business banking account, professional liability insurance, a registered address for official correspondence. The requirements were straightforward, but each one required money I didn't have independent access to. I opened our joint checking account online, my stomach nodding as I reviewed the recent transactions. Austin had been busy during his Italian vacation. Charges at expensive restaurants in Milan, a luxury hotel in Rome, shopping at high-end boutiques. In 1 week, He'd spent more on his romantic getaway than I'd earned in freelance income in 2 months. But scrolling through the account history, I discovered something that made my pulse race. The freelance payments I'd been receiving for Austin's real estate projects were still being deposited. The latest one, for marketing materials I'd completed just days before my surgery, had arrived yesterday. $3,000 for a comprehensive campaign I'd developed for Austin's newest luxury development. According to the deposit record, the payment had come from Pinnacle Property Group, Austin's primary client. But that seemed odd. Usually, Austin's company received payments from clients, then paid me as a subcontractor. Why would Pinnacle pay me directly? I dug deeper into my email archives, searching for the original contract I'd signed for that project. When I found it, my hands started shaking. The agreement wasn't between me and Austin's company. It was directly between Richardson Communications Consulting and Pinnacle Property Group. Austin had set up the contract using my business license, but he'd been intercepting and managing all client communications. I'd been doing work for major corporations as an independent consultant, but Austin had positioned himself as my business manager, handling all correspondence and negotiations. My business had been operating for 2 years without my knowledge. Austin had been using my credentials and license to secure high-paying contracts, then managing the relationship so thoroughly that I'd believed I was just doing freelance work for his company. I spent the next 6 hours combing through emails, bank records, and contract files. The picture that emerged was staggering. Over the past 2 years, Richardson Communications Consulting had generated over $240,000 in revenue from 6 major clients. I'd been operating as a legitimate business consultant, creating marketing strategies and crisis communications plans for some of Denver's largest real estate development firms. But Austin had structured everything, so I never realized the scope of what I was building. He'd handled all client calls, managed all contract negotiations, and controlled all financial communications. To the clients, I was the brilliant strategist behind successful campaigns. To me, I was just a freelancer helping my husband's business. The most shocking discovery came when I found my original business registration documents. Austin had filed as my business partner and financial manager, giving him legal authority to sign contracts and manage accounts on behalf of Richardson Communications Consulting. I'd been so trusting when he'd offered to help with the paperwork that I'd signed documents without reading them carefully. He'd positioned himself as essential to my business operations while convincing me I didn't actually have a business. But now, with Austin out of the country and me suddenly aware of what I'd actually built, I had options I hadn't known existed. Called Pinnacle Property Group, my heart hammering as I asked to speak with their marketing director. "Ms. Richardson." Bill Morrison's voice was warm and enthusiastic when he came on the line. "Perfect timing. We just got approval for the Riverside Commons project, and we're hoping Richardson Communications can handle the entire campaign. When can we schedule a strategy meeting?" I gripped the phone tighter. "I'd love to discuss it. Could you tell me more about the scope?" Comprehensive branding, crisis prevention strategy, and public relations for a $50 million mixed-use development. We're thinking a 6-month contract, probably around $75,000 for the full package. Your work on the Pinnacle Heights campaign was exactly what we needed. $75,000. For 6 months of work I was completely qualified to do. Work I'd essentially been doing already, just without realizing I was running my own consultancy. That sounds very interesting, I managed. I'll need to review my current project load and get back to you with availability. Of course. Your business manager mentioned you might be expanding operations. This could be perfect timing for both of us. My business manager. Austin had been representing himself as my business manager to clients, making himself appear essential while keeping me in the dark about the true nature and value of my work. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house processing what I'd learned. I wasn't a dependent wife who'd sacrificed her career for marriage. I was an established business consultant who'd been systematically deceived about her own success. Austin hadn't been supporting my career by giving me freelance work. He'd been managing and controlling a business I'd built with my own skills and reputation. He'd left me stranded in a hospital because he thought I was helpless without him. But the truth was, he'd been helpless without me. My skills, my business, license, my client relationships, those were the foundation of his recent success. And now, for the first time in 2 years, I had direct access to all of it. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. Richardson Communications. Consulting. Strategic business plan. Austin thought he'd abandoned a dependent housewife. He was about to discover he'd abandoned a successful business owner who was just getting started. The morning after my revelation about Richardson Communications Consulting, I woke up with a plan forming in my mind. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep Austin's deception ran. I made coffee and settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, preparing to excavate the full scope of what he'd hidden from me. The more I dug into our shared digital life, the more disturbing the picture became. Austin hadn't just been managing my business. He'd been systematically positioning himself as indispensable while keeping me deliberately ignorant of my own success. I found email threads between Austin and my clients dating back 18 months, all conducted without my knowledge. In these exchanges, he referred to himself as my business partner and account manager, explaining that I was the creative genius who preferred to focus on strategy rather than administrative details. The clients clearly respected my work immensely. Bill Morrison from Pinnacle Property Group had written, "Gracie's crisis management strategy for the Riverside zoning controversy was brilliant. She anticipated every possible media angle and had responses prepared that actually turned negative coverage into positive press. I've never seen anything like it." Another client, Ron Martinez from Summit Development, had emailed, "The rebranding campaign Gracie designed increased our pre-sales by 40%. Her market analysis was spot on, and the messaging strategy she developed resonated perfectly with our target demographic. We want to retain Richardson Communications for all our future projects." I stared at these emails in disbelief. These weren't the responses to simple freelance marketing materials. These were sophisticated business strategies that had generated real results for major corporations. I'd been operating at a level I didn't even know I'd achieved. But what made my stomach turn was reading Austin's responses to these compliments. Instead of forwarding the praise to me, he'd written back things like, "Gracie is incredibly talented, but she struggles with the business side of consulting. I handle all the client relationships and project management so she can focus on what she does best." He'd been taking credit for managing relationships with clients who thought they were working directly with me. Even worse, he'd been positioning my apparent inability to handle business operations as the reason they needed to work through him. I found contracts I'd never seen, all signed with Austin's electronic signature on behalf of Richardson Communications. The terms were far more favorable than I'd realized. These weren't small freelance gigs. They were retainer agreements worth tens of thousands of dollars, with performance bonuses and renewal clauses. One contract with Taylor and Associates, no relation to my friend Taylor, included a clause. I read 3 times before believing. Richardson Communications will provide ongoing crisis management consulting and media strategy services for an annual retainer of $60,000. Plus additional project fees ranging from $15,000 to $25,000 per campaign. $60,000 annually, just from one client, plus project fees that could double that amount. I'd been earning more money than I'd made in my entire journalism career, but Austin had managed the finances so completely that I'd believed I was contributing modestly to our household income. My hands shook as I opened our business checking account. An account I'd apparently had signature authority on for 2 years without knowing it existed. The balance made me dizzy. $127,000. $127,000 in an account I'd been legally entitled to access this entire time. I scrolled through the transaction history, watching deposits and withdrawals that told the story of a thriving consulting business. Large deposits from major clients, followed by transfers to our joint personal account, transfers Austin had described to me as his latest real estate commission or quarterly bonuses from his development projects. My business success had been funding our lifestyle, the luxury apartment, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes Austin had bought me. It had all been paid for with money I'd earned, but didn't know I was earning. The cruelest irony was that Austin had been using my money to control me. Every time he'd bought me a gift or covered a major expense, every time he'd made me feel financially dependent on his generosity, he'd been spending my own income. I found a folder on Austin's computer labeled Gracie Projects, a folder I'd never noticed before. Inside were detailed profiles of my clients, including personal information about their business challenges, family situations, and professional vulnerabilities. Austin had been conducting research on these executives, gathering intelligence about their companies and personal lives. But it wasn't market research. Reading through Austin's notes, I realized he'd been collecting potential blackmail material. Information about extramarital affairs, financial irregularities, regulatory violations, anything that could be used to pressure clients if necessary. One file on Bill Morrison included notes about his son's drug problems and his wife's gambling debts. Another on Ron Martinez detailed a sexual harassment allegation from a former employee that had been settled out of court. Austin had been systematically gathering compromising information about the executives who trusted my business. My blood ran cold as I understood the implications. Austin hadn't just been stealing credit for my professional success, he'd been positioning himself to potentially blackmail my clients. He'd turned my legitimate consulting business into a vehicle for collecting leverage over powerful people. But the most devastating discovery came in a folder labeled Future Plans. Inside was a detailed business proposal Austin had been developing to sell Richardson Communications to a major PR firm in Los Angeles. According to his projections, my client list and reputation were worth approximately $400,000 in an acquisition deal. He'd been planning to sell my business, without telling me it existed. The proposal included a clause that would relocate key personnel to Los Angeles, effectively moving me across the country under the guise of a career opportunity, while removing me even further from any independent support system. At the bottom of the document was an email draft addressed to the LA firm's acquisition team. Gracie is brilliant but requires significant management and guidance. As her business partner and account manager, I would need to be included in any acquisition to ensure continuity of client relationships and operational stability. Austin had been planning to sell my business and position himself as an essential part of the deal, guaranteeing his control would continue even under new ownership. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen, trying to process the full scope of what I'd discovered. Austin hadn't just abandoned me for an Italian vacation with his online girlfriend. He'd been systematically preparing to sell my business, relocate me away from any potential support system, and maintain control over every aspect of my professional life. The hospital abandonment wasn't a moment of cruel impulse. It was part of a calculated plan that had been months in the making. But Austin had made one critical miscalculation. By leaving me alone with access to our shared digital life, he'd handed me the keys to understanding exactly what he'd stolen from me. And more importantly, he'd given me the evidence I needed to take it all back. I picked up my phone and called the number I'd found in Austin's contact list for Pierre Dubois, the attorney who'd been handling Austin's real estate contracts. If Austin trusted this lawyer with his business deals, Pierre would understand the legal implications of what I'd discovered. "Mr. Dubois," I said when he answered, "this is Gracie Richardson. I believe my husband Austin has been conducting some business on my behalf that I need to discuss with you. I think I'm going to need legal representation." The trust I'd given Austin so freely was about to become the weapon I used to destroy him. Pierre Dubois agreed to meet me that afternoon at his downtown office, his voice carefully neutral when I explained I needed to discuss some irregularities in my business arrangements. As I prepared for the meeting, I realized I should have seen the warning signs of Austin's deception much earlier. The red flags had been there, hidden in plain sight behind my willingness to trust completely. The first sign should have been Austin's insistence on handling all my business communications from the very beginning. When I'd started doing freelance work for his real estate projects, he'd suggested I forward all client emails to him first, for context, since he understood their needs better. "You're so focused on the creative side," he'd said, kissing my forehead as I worked late on a marketing campaign. "Let me handle the boring business stuff so you can do what you do best." I'd been grateful for his help. Managing client expectations and contract negotiations had always been my least favorite part of any job. Austin seemed natural at it, confident, and professional in ways that made me feel protected rather than controlled. But looking back, I realized he'd been systematically inserting himself between me and my clients from day one. When Pinnacle Property Group had first expressed interest in retaining my services, Austin had been the one to negotiate the terms. When Summit Development wanted to expand their contract, Austin had handled those discussions too. "They love your work," he'd report back after client calls I was never invited to join. "But they want someone who can handle the account management side too. Lucky for us, I can wear both hats." I'd never questioned why I wasn't included in these business discussions. Austin's explanations always seemed reasonable. The clients preferred working with one point of contact. My time was better spent on creative development. He had more experience with corporate negotiations. The second warning sign had been Austin's reaction whenever I'd shown interest in expanding my own professional network. 6 months ago, I'd mentioned wanting to attend a communications industry conference in Las Vegas. 3 days in Vegas by yourself? Austin had raised an eyebrow. "You know those conferences are just excuses for people to party and cheat on their spouses, right?" When I'd protested that it was a professional development opportunity, he'd shifted tactics. "Of course, if you think it's important for your career. I just worry about you traveling alone. Remember what happened to Sarah's friend at that conference in Chicago?" He'd been referring to a story about a woman who'd been drugged at a hotel bar, though that incident had happened at a completely different type of event. But Austin's concern had seemed genuine, and I'd ultimately decided the conference wasn't worth the risk or expense. The same pattern had emerged whenever I'd considered joining professional organizations or attending networking events. Austin always had a story about someone who'd had a terrible experience, or a logical reason why my time would be better spent on current projects. "You're already building such a great reputation through our existing clients," he'd say. "Why? Dilute your brand by chasing random connections?" I'd internalized his perspective, believing I was being strategic rather than recognizing I was being isolated. The third sign should have been Austin's increasing control over our social calendar and friendships. He'd never explicitly forbidden me from seeing Taylor or my other friends, but he'd developed a talent for scheduling competing obligations whenever they invited me to events. "Oh, you have dinner plans with Taylor tonight?" he'd say, looking disappointed. "I was hoping we could work on the Pinnacle presentation together. But if your friend is more important than this $30,000 contract..." He'd never made it an ultimatum, but the implication was clear. Professional responsibilities should take priority over social activities. And since I'd believed Austin was helping me build my career, disappointing him felt like sabotaging my own future. Gradually, my friendships had withered from neglect. Taylor had stopped calling as often when I repeatedly canceled plans. My college friends had stopped including me in group activities when I consistently had work commitments that prevented me from joining them. Austin had replaced my independent social network with his business associates and their wives. At the charity galas and client dinners we attended together, I was introduced as Austin's brilliant wife who helps with marketing, rather than as an independent professional with my own credentials. The fourth warning sign had been Austin's subtle discouragement of my financial independence. When I'd mentioned wanting to set up my own retirement account separate from our joint investments, he'd launched into a detailed explanation of how splitting our assets would cost us money in fees and reduce our buying power. "We're building wealth together," he'd explained, showing me spreadsheets that demonstrated how our combined financial strategy was more efficient than individual accounts. Why pay double the management fees when we can maximize our returns? As a team? His logic had been compelling, backed by charts and projections that made my desire for financial independence seem selfish and short-sighted. I'd agreed to keep everything combined, believing I was making a mature decision about our shared future. But the most telling warning sign had been Austin's reaction to my growing confidence in my professional abilities. As I'd become more skilled at crisis communications and strategic planning, I'd occasionally suggested different approaches to client challenges. Austin's response had become increasingly dismissive. "That's an interesting idea, sweetheart, but you don't understand the full context of their business situation. Let me handle the strategic decisions." When clients had praised my work directly during the few phone calls I'd been included in, Austin had quickly redirected the conversation to implementation details he would manage. My growing expertise had seemed to make him more controlling, not more collaborative. "You're so creative," he'd say, "but business strategy requires a different kind of thinking. Good thing we make such a great team." I'd interpreted his behavior as protectiveness, not recognizing it as a systematic effort to prevent me from realizing my own capabilities and value. The final warning sign should have been Austin's increasing interest in relocating. Over the past 6 months, he'd been mentioning job opportunities in other cities, always framed as exciting adventures we could pursue together. "Los Angeles has such a dynamic real estate market," he'd say, showing me luxury apartment listings in Beverly Hills. "We could really expand our business there." Our business. Even his language had been calculated to make me feel included while ensuring I remained dependent on his management and connections. But sitting in Pierre Dubois' office that afternoon, all these warning signs crystallized into a clear pattern of deliberate manipulation. Austin hadn't been protecting me or helping me build a career. He'd been systematically isolating me from independent resources while positioning himself as indispensable to my success. Pierre listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who'd seen similar situations before. When I finished explaining what I'd discovered about my business and Austin's deception, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Richardson," he said carefully, "what you're describing constitutes fraud, identity theft, and potentially embezzlement. Your husband has been operating a business using your credentials without your knowledge, which is a serious criminal matter." I felt a chill run through me. Criminal matter. I'd been thinking in terms of betrayal and deception, but Pierre was talking about actual crimes. "What you need to understand," he continued, "is that Austin's abandonment of you may have been the best thing that could have happened. He's given you the opportunity to discover his illegal activities and take action before he could complete whatever larger scheme he was planning." Pierre was right. Austin's cruelty had accidentally exposed his criminality, and now I had the evidence to make him pay for both. Pierre Dubois had agreed to represent me, but first he wanted me to fully understand the legal implications of what Austin had done. "Before we proceed," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened the day of your surgery. Every detail could be crucial." I took a deep breath and began recounting that terrible morning, but this time with the benefit of understanding Austin's true motivations. The events took on a sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of his systematic deception. Austin had seemed unusually agitated during the drive to the hospital, constantly checking his phone despite my obvious distress. At the time, I'd attributed his distraction to worry about my condition. Now I realized he'd been coordinating his departure plans while I writhed in pain beside him. "When did the pain start?" Pierre asked, taking notes. "Around midnight. By 2 a.m. I couldn't stand up straight." Austin finally agreed to drive me to the emergency room when I started vomiting. But looking back, Austin's reluctance to take me to the hospital made more sense now. He'd kept suggesting I wait until morning, that it was probably just food poisoning, that hospital bills were expensive. He'd been calculating whether he could delay my medical care long enough to execute whatever plan he'd been developing. When we'd finally arrived at St. Mary's, Austin had been on his phone constantly while I was being examined and prepped for surgery. The nurses had to ask him twice to step outside during my IV insertion because his conversation was disrupting their work. "I heard him talking about travel arrangements," I told Pierre. But I thought maybe he was rescheduling business meetings because of my emergency. The timeline became clear as I reconstructed those hours. While I was being wheeled into surgery at 4:30 a.m., Austin had been finalizing his flight to Milan. The boarding pass receipt I'd found in his email showed a 7:45 a.m. departure from Denver International Airport. He'd calculated exactly how long my surgery would take and booked a flight that would get him out of the country before I regained consciousness. But the most calculated betrayal had been the text messages sent from my phone while I was under anesthesia. Austin had used my thumbprint to unlock my device and sent carefully crafted messages to everyone who might have come to help me. Pierre examined screenshots I'd taken of these messages. "These aren't just deceptive," he said grimly. "They constitute identity fraud. He used your digital identity to isolate you from potential support, which shows premeditation." The message to my sister Dolores had been particularly cruel. "Surgery went perfectly. Austin is being such an amazing husband, taking time off work to take care of me. I'm so lucky to have him. Don't worry about flying out here. I'll be back on my feet in no time." Austin had known Dolores would immediately book a flight if she thought I needed help. The message had been designed to prevent that while making. Austin appeared devoted. The text to my friend Taylor had been equally manipulative. "Thanks for offering to come stay with me during recovery, but Austin has everything handled. He's hired a private nurse and taken 2 weeks off work. I'm in such good hands. We'll call you when I'm feeling more like myself." Taylor had never offered to stay with me. She lived in Portland and had her own family responsibilities. But Austin's message had preemptively declined help that might have been offered while again positioning himself as the perfect caregiver. Most disturbing were the messages sent to my professional contacts. Austin had texted Bill Morrison, "Had emergency surgery but recovering well. Austin is managing all Richardson Communications business until I'm back at 100%. He has my full authority to handle any urgent matters." That single text had given Austin legal cover to continue operating my business in my absence, potentially for weeks or months while I recovered. "This wasn't impulsive," Pierre said, reviewing the evidence. "Your husband had been planning this abandonment as part of a larger scheme. The business sale documents we found suggest he intended to relocate you to Los Angeles, probably under the guise of your recovery requiring a change of scenery." I nodded, remembering Austin's recent comments about how a warmer climate might be good for your health, and his suggestions that we consider making a fresh start somewhere new. Pierre pulled out a folder and began spreading documents across his conference table. "Here's what I believe happened. Austin discovered that your business was far more valuable than he'd initially realized. The contracts you've been unknowingly fulfilling have established you as one of Denver's premier crisis communications consultants." He pointed to a spreadsheet showing my client revenue over the past 2 years. "Your annual income from consulting work is approximately $240,000. But Austin has been positioning himself as essential to these relationships, which would make your business nearly impossible to sell without him." The LA acquisition deal Austin had been negotiating would have netted him $400,000 immediately, plus a guaranteed management position overseeing his wife's consulting practice. He would have profited enormously from selling my business while ensuring his continued control over my professional life. The emergency surgery disrupted his timeline, Pierre continued. He couldn't very well relocate you while you were recovering from an appendectomy, so he improvised. Austin's plan had been to abandon me temporarily while he went to Italy to pursue his online relationship. The fake text messages would buy him weeks of time while preventing anyone from checking on me too closely. He'd expected to return before I fully understood what had happened, probably with some story about a business emergency that had required his immediate attention. He planned to gaslight you about the abandonment, Pierre explained. Make you believe you'd misunderstood the situation or been too medicated to remember clearly. Then he'd position himself as your devoted husband who'd sacrificed his own needs to arrange your recovery opportunity in Los Angeles. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Austin had been willing to leave me alone and vulnerable after major surgery, not as a moment of angry impulse, but as a calculated step in a plan to steal my business and relocate me away from any support system. But Austin had made critical mistakes in his haste. By using my phone to send the deceptive messages, he'd created a digital trail that proved fraud. By abandoning me before I'd fully recovered, he'd given me time to discover his deception while his defenses were down. Most importantly, he'd underestimated me completely. He'd assumed I would remain helpless and dependent, grateful for his eventual return, rather than capable of uncovering his crimes. Mrs. Richardson, Pierre said, closing the folders, your husband didn't just abandon you. He committed multiple felonies in the process. Identity fraud, business fraud, possibly extortion given the blackmail material he's collected on your clients. I felt a cold satisfaction settling over me. Austin had been so confident in his control over me that he'd become careless. His cruelty had been his downfall. What do we do now? I asked. Pierre smiled grimly. Now we make sure Austin Richardson regrets every decision he made that day, starting with freezing all accounts associated with your business and ensuring he can't access any of your assets from Italy. Austin had abandoned what he thought was a helpless wife. Instead, he'd abandoned a successful business owner who was about to become his worst nightmare. The morning after my meeting with Pierre, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. Armed with legal representation and a clear understanding of Austin's crimes, I was ready to take back control of my life. But first, I needed to conduct one final investigation to ensure I'd uncovered the full scope of his deception. Pierre had given me homework: document everything, secure all evidence, and prepare for the possibility that Austin's fraud extended beyond what we'd already discovered. Men like your husband don't usually limit themselves to one scheme, he'd warned. If he's been this calculating about your business, there are likely other deceptions we haven't found yet. I started with our financial records, this time looking for patterns I'd missed during my initial shock. What I found made my stomach turn. Austin hadn't just been stealing from my business. He'd been systematically looting our joint accounts to fund his double life. The Italy trip hadn't been a spontaneous romantic adventure. Scrolling through our credit card statements, I found evidence of careful planning spanning months. A premium Italian language learning app subscription, charges at high-end luggage stores, purchase of expensive cologne and clothing from brands I'd never seen him wear. Most damning was a charge I'd initially overlooked: $847 to Romance Tours International, dated 6 weeks before my surgery. When I Googled the company, my heart sank. They specialized in introducing successful American men to sophisticated European women through luxury travel packages and exclusive dating events. Austin hadn't met someone online randomly. He'd paid nearly $1,000 to join an organized tour designed to help married men find mistresses in Italy. I found the email confirmations buried in a folder Austin thought he'd hidden. The tour company had promised discreet arrangements and beautiful, cultured women seeking generous American partners. The package included luxury accommodations, guided tours of romantic destinations, and intimate dinner arrangements with carefully selected companions. Reading these materials, I realized Austin's abandonment of me had been the culmination of months of calculated planning. He'd been preparing to leave me long before my appendicitis provided the perfect cover story. But the most devastating discovery came when I dug deeper into our mortgage and property records. The house I'd believed we owned together, the home I'd been recovering in, the place I'd thought represented our shared future, wasn't actually mine at all. Austin had refinanced our mortgage 6 months ago without telling me. Despite my name being on the original deed, the new loan documents listed him as the sole borrower and owner. He'd somehow removed my ownership stake in our home while convincing me nothing had changed. I called Pierre immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd found. "He forged your signature," Pierre said grimly after I emailed him the documents. "This is identity theft and fraud on a massive scale. He's been systematically removing your legal claim to marital assets while making it appear nothing changed." The pattern became clear as Pierre walked me through the legal implications. Austin had been preparing for divorce long before Italy, but he'd wanted to ensure I'd be left with nothing when he finally made his move. The business fraud, the property theft, the financial manipulation. It had all been designed to leave me legally and financially helpless. The Italy trip was probably meant to be permanent, Pierre explained. He was planning to establish residency overseas where he'd be harder to pursue legally. He would have returned eventually to formalize the divorce, but by then, all the assets would have been beyond your reach. I hung up feeling sick, but also strangely relieved. Every question I'd had about Austin's behavior now had an answer. He hadn't suddenly become cruel. He'd been systematically planning my destruction for months. But Austin had made one critical miscalculation. By abandoning me before completing his asset transfer scheme, he'd given me the opportunity to discover his plans and fight back. If my appendix hadn't ruptured, if he'd had a few more months to complete his preparations, I might have been left with nothing. That afternoon, I received a call that would change everything. Taylor, my friend in Portland whom I'd barely spoken to in months, was calling with news that made my blood run cold. "Gracie, I know things have been weird between us lately," she began. "But I had to call you. I was at a conference in Seattle yesterday and I ran into someone who said they knew you. Marjorie something? She works for a PR firm in Los Angeles." My heart started racing. Marjorie, one of the names from Austin's business contacts. "She was asking really strange questions about you," Taylor continued. "Wanting to know about your mental health, whether you'd been having problems in your marriage, if you'd shown signs of emotional instability. She said Austin had contacted her firm about getting you professional help and possibly relocating you to California for treatment." The room started spinning around me. Austin hadn't just been planning to abandon me. He'd been setting up a narrative that would justify having me committed or declared mentally incompetent. "Gracie, are you there? This woman was talking about you like you were having some kind of breakdown, but she also seemed very interested in your business. She kept asking about your client relationships and whether you'd be able to work if you moved to LA. I gripped the phone tighter. "Taylor, I need you to tell me exactly what she said." As Taylor recounted the conversation, the final piece of Austin's plan became clear. He hadn't just been preparing to steal my business. He'd been laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally unfit to manage it myself. The LA PR firm wasn't interested in acquiring Richardson Communications. They were being set up to become my legal guardians, with Austin as my medical proxy, making all decisions about my treatment and business operations. If the hospital abandonment had gone according to plan, Austin would have returned to find me traumatized and unable to cope. With the help of the LA firm, he would have arranged for my recovery in California, where I'd be isolated from anyone who might question his version of events. Under the guise of caring for my mental health, Austin would have gained complete control over my business, my finances, and my personal freedom. I would have become a legal prisoner in my own life. But his plan had a fatal flaw. By abandoning me before I was truly broken, he'd given me the strength and time to uncover his scheme. And now I had evidence of not just fraud, but conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. Austin thought he'd been so clever, but his greed and impatience had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him completely. After Taylor's call about the LA firm, I spent the rest of that day in a state of numb shock. The full scope of Austin's betrayal was so comprehensive, so meticulously planned, that I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was facing. He hadn't just stolen from me, he'd been orchestrating my complete psychological and legal destruction. I sat on our living room couch, surrounded by documents and printouts that told the story of my own systematic dismantling. Bank statements showing Austin's methodical asset transfer, email chains revealing his coordination with the LAPR firm, credit card records documenting his months of preparation for abandoning me. The house felt haunted by evidence of Austin's deception. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every shared memory had been tainted by the knowledge that he'd been planning my destruction while pretending to love me. I tried calling Dolores, but couldn't bring myself to explain what I'd discovered. How do you tell your sister that your husband had been planning to have you declared mentally incompetent? How do you admit that every aspect of your life had been a carefully constructed lie? Instead, I found myself researching the psychological condition Austin had been preparing to use against me. The LA firm's interest in my mental health made more sense once I understood how conservatorship laws worked. Austin could have had me declared unable to manage my own affairs, giving him legal control over my business, finances, and personal decisions. Famous cases filled my search results. Wealthy individuals trapped in legal arrangements that stripped them of all autonomy. With the right medical testimony and a sympathetic judge, Austin could have had me committed to a facility where I'd have no contact with the outside world and no ability to contest his control. The genius of his plan was its apparent kindness. He would have positioned himself as a devoted husband seeking the best care for his mentally ill wife. The business fraud would have been explained as his reluctant assumption of responsibilities I was no longer capable of handling. My isolation from friends and family would have been presented as necessary for my recovery. By evening, the weight of what I was facing felt crushing. Austin had money, connections, and a 2-year head start on executing his plan. He'd systematically removed my access to independent resources while building relationships with people who believed his version of our story. Even with Pierre's legal expertise, I felt like I was fighting a battle Austin had been preparing for. While I'd been completely unaware there was a war, the emotional toll was devastating. Every memory of our marriage was now suspect. Had Austin ever genuinely loved me, or had I been a target from the beginning? When he'd held my hand during my father's funeral, had he been calculating how my grief might make me more dependent? When he'd celebrated my professional successes, had he been planning how to steal them? I found myself questioning my own judgment about everything. If I'd been so completely deceived about the most intimate relationship in my life, how could I trust my instincts about anything else? Austin had convinced me that up was down and black was white for 3 years. What else might I be wrong about? The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his scheme. Austin had systematically severed my connections to everyone who might have offered perspective or support. My professional network knew only Austin's version of our relationship. My friends had been gradually pushed away. Even my family lived hundreds of miles away. I was surrounded by evidence of Austin's crimes, but I had no one to share the burden with. No one who could witness my discovery and validate that I wasn't imagining the conspiracy against me. In a house filled with proof of betrayal, I felt completely alone. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed moments from our marriage, searching for signs I'd missed, clues that might have warned me about Austin's true nature. The mental loop was exhausting but compulsive, as if understanding how I'd been deceived could somehow undo the damage. I started having panic attacks during the day, triggered by seemingly random reminders of Austin's control. Opening our joint bank account online sent my heart racing. Seeing his toothbrush in our bathroom made me nauseous. The sound of his phone notification tone, still playing from messages he continued receiving, made me jump out of my skin. The psychological manipulation had been so complete that even with evidence of Austin's crimes, part of me still questioned whether I was overreacting. His voice echoed in my head, explaining away inconsistencies, minimizing my concerns, making me doubt my own perceptions. But the darkest moment came when I realized how close Austin had come to succeeding. If my appendix hadn't ruptured, if he'd had a few more months to complete his preparations, I would have found myself trapped in Los Angeles with no legal recourse and no understanding of what had been done to me. I would have been drugged, isolated, and declared incompetent while Austin controlled every aspect of my existence. My business success would have funded my own imprisonment, while Austin lived freely on the profits from my work. The thought of that alternate timeline, of waking up in a psychiatric facility with no memory of how I'd gotten there, no access to help, and no hope of escape, sent me into the deepest despair I'd ever experienced. But somewhere in that darkness, an ember of anger began to glow. Austin had been so confident in his plan, so certain of my helplessness, that he'd become arrogant. He'd left evidence everywhere because he'd never imagined I'd be capable of finding it. His greatest mistake had been underestimating me. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. The morning I decided to fight back started like all the others since Austin's abandonment, with me staring at evidence of his betrayal spread across our kitchen table. But something had shifted overnight. The despair that had been consuming me for days crystallized into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous to Austin's plans. I'd spent the previous evening reading about conservatorship abuse, cases, studying how wealthy individuals had been trapped by people they trusted. The common thread in every story was the victim's isolation and their abuser's careful preparation. Austin had been following this playbook perfectly, except for one critical miscalculation. He'd left me alone with all the evidence. By abandoning me at the hospital, Austin had accidentally given me access to our shared digital life while he was out of the country. He'd assumed I'd be too traumatized and medicated to investigate, too dependent and trusting to question his version of events. Instead, his cruelty had stripped away my blind faith and replaced it with investigative instincts I'd honed during my journalism career. I called Pierre at exactly 8 a.m. "I want to take everything," I said without preamble. "The business, the house, every asset he thinks he's stolen from me. And I want him charged criminally for what he's done." Pierre was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Richardson, I appreciate your anger, but we need to be strategic. Austin has had 2 years to position himself legally. Fighting him will be expensive and time-consuming." "How expensive?" "Potentially hundreds of thousands in legal fees, depending on how aggressively he defends himself. And there's no guarantee we'll recover everything, even with the evidence you've gathered." I thought about the $127,000 sitting in my business account, money Austin didn't know I'd discovered. What if cost wasn't an issue? What if I told you, I have independent resources he doesn't know about? Pierre's tone sharpened with interest. In that case, we'd have significantly more options. But Mrs. Richardson, this kind of legal war can take years. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? I looked around the house where Austin had systematically dismantled my life while pretending to love me, where he'd planned my imprisonment while accepting my trust, where he'd stolen my success while convincing me I was dependent on his support. Pierre, my husband, spent 2 years planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and imprisoned in a psychiatric facility so he could steal my business. He was going to drug me, isolate me, and control every aspect of my existence while living off my work. Yes, I'm prepared for war. We scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. But first, I had other calls to make. I started with Bill Morrison at Pinnacle Property Group. When his assistant put me through, I took a deep breath and made the most important professional decision of my life. Bill, this is Gracie Richardson. I need to inform you that effective immediately, Austin Richardson is no longer authorized to conduct any business on behalf of Richardson Communications. If he contacts you claiming to represent my company, please don't engage with him and contact me directly. Gracie? Bill sounded confused. Is everything all right? Austin said you were recovering from surgery and he'd be handling your accounts for the next few months. That's exactly what I'm calling about. Austin has been representing himself as my business partner without my authorization. I've discovered he's been conducting business using my credentials while keeping me unaware of the scope and value of my own company. I could hear papers shuffling on Bill's end. I'm not sure I understand. Austin has been managing our account for over a year. Are you saying he wasn't authorized to do that? I'm saying that Richardson Communications is my business, not our business. Austin inserted himself into client relationships without my knowledge, and has been taking credit for work I've been doing independently. I'm calling all my clients today to clarify the actual structure of my company and Austin's unauthorized involvement. The conversation was awkward but necessary. Bill agreed to deal directly with me going forward and promised to send me copies of all correspondence Austin had conducted on my behalf. Similar calls to Ron Martinez at Summit Development and my other clients yielded the same response. Confusion followed by agreement to work directly with me. By afternoon, I'd reclaimed control of my business relationships and cut Austin out of all client communications. My phone had been ringing constantly with callbacks from executives who wanted to understand what had happened and confirm the status of their projects. The response was uniformly supportive. Every client expressed concern about Austin's unauthorized representation and relief that I was taking direct control of their accounts. Several mentioned they'd always preferred working with me directly and had found Austin's involvement unnecessary and sometimes problematic. Honestly, Gracie, Ron Martinez told me during our call, Austin always seemed like he was trying too hard to insert himself into discussions where he didn't add value. We hired Richardson Communications because of your strategic thinking, not his account management. That feedback gave me confidence for my meeting with Pierre. I wasn't just a victim seeking justice, I was a successful business owner with strong client relationships and substantial resources. Pierre's office felt different this time. Instead of being a desperate woman seeking help, I walked in as someone ready to wage a calculated campaign against Austin's fraud. I've secured my business relationships, I reported. Austin has been cut out of all client communications, and my revenue stream is protected. I've also discovered we have more evidence than we initially realized. I handed Pierre a folder containing every fraudulent document Austin had signed on my behalf, every forged authorization, every email where he'd misrepresented his role in my business. I'd spent the morning building a comprehensive case that would be difficult for Austin to defend. This is substantial, Pierre said, reviewing the materials. With this level of documentation, we're not just talking about recovering assets. We're talking about potential criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Good. What's our first move? Pierre smiled for the first time since I'd met him. We freeze everything Austin thinks he controls, secure all assets he's stolen, and file charges that will have him arrested the moment he returns to the United States. Austin had spent 2 years planning my destruction. Now I was going to spend however long it took planning his. The first week of my counterattack against Austin felt like learning to walk again. Every decision required tremendous mental energy. Every action felt foreign after years of deferring to Austin's judgment. But with Pierre's guidance and my own determination, I began dismantling the cage Austin had built around me. Our first strategic move was freezing all joint assets before Austin could access them from Italy. Pierre filed emergency court orders citing fraud and identity theft, supported by the overwhelming evidence I'd gathered. Within 48 hours, Austin's access to our joint accounts, credit cards, and property was completely severed. The beauty of acting while he's out of the country, Pierre explained as we reviewed the court orders, is that Austin can't respond immediately. By the time he understands what's happening, we'll have secured everything he thought he controlled. But securing assets was only the beginning. I had to learn to run my business as the independent entity it had always been, without Austin's shadowy management. My first challenge was establishing my own banking systems and financial controls. Opening a new business checking account should have been simple, but I discovered Austin had somehow linked my business credit to his personal finances. When I tried to establish independent banking relationships, I was told my business credit was complicated and would require additional documentation. Pierre helped me understand what Austin had done. He'd positioned himself as a guarantor for my business accounts, making it appear that my company's financial stability depended on his personal creditworthiness. Untangling this web required hours of calls with bank officials, credit agencies, and business licensing authorities. "Your husband was very thorough," the business banking specialist told me during one particularly frustrating phone call. "According to our records, your company has never operated independently of his financial backing. Establishing separate credit will take time. Time I didn't have. My clients expected continuity of service, and I couldn't operate indefinitely without proper banking infrastructure. I had to find creative solutions while legal proceedings slowly unwound Austin's manipulations. The solution came from an unexpected source. Bill Morrison at Pinnacle Property Group, learning about my situation during one of our project calls, offered to help restructure our contract to include immediate payment terms that would improve my cash flow while I established independent banking. "Richardson Communications has been invaluable to our projects," he told me. "If cash flow timing helps you maintain independence from whatever your husband was doing, we're happy to adjust our payment schedule." Similar support came from my other clients. Ron Martinez at Summit Development offered a substantial advance on our next project. Taylor and Associates restructured their retainer to provide monthly payments instead of quarterly. Within 2 weeks, I had enough independent cash flow to operate without any connection to Austin's financial manipulations. But the professional challenges were only part of my adaptation struggle. Living alone in the house where Austin had deceived me felt like occupying a crime scene. Every room contained reminders of his calculated manipulation. His home office where he'd conducted fraudulent business on my behalf. Our bedroom where he'd planned my imprisonment while pretending to love me. I spent the first week sleeping on the living room couch, unable to face the bedroom we'd shared. Simple tasks like cooking dinner or watching television felt surreal when conducted in spaces where Austin had systematically plotted my destruction. The psychological impact was more challenging than the practical obstacles. Years of having Austin filter my professional communications meant I had to relearn how to interact directly with clients, vendors, and colleagues. His constant helpful management had left me uncertain about my own judgment in business situations. During my first solo client presentation since discovering Austin's deception, I found myself second-guessing every decision. Should I include more financial projections? Was my timeline too aggressive? Austin's voice echoed in my head, offering improvements to my strategy. The presentation went excellently, but I spent the entire evening replaying every interaction, worried I'd made. Mistakes Austin would have caught. It took several similar successes before I began trusting my own professional instincts again. Learning to manage my business finances independently proved especially difficult. Austin had convinced me I was too creative for financial management, handling all invoicing, contract negotiations, and budget planning. Now I had to master these skills while maintaining client relationships and building legal cases against him. Pierre recommended a business consultant who specialized in helping entrepreneurs transition from partnerships to solo operations. Marjorie. Chen, no relation to any of Austin's contacts, became instrumental in helping me understand the financial side of my business. "Your profit margins are actually much higher than most consultancies," she told me during our first meeting. "Austin's management was costing you money, not saving it. His fees and overhead expenses were eating into profits that should have been yours." This revelation was both liberating and infuriating. Austin hadn't just been stealing credit for my work. He'd been charging my business for the privilege of being controlled and deceived. The most difficult adaptation was emotional. 3 years of marriage had trained me to consider Austin's opinion on every decision, from business strategies to what to eat for dinner. Making choices independently felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I started small, with decisions Austin had always controlled. I bought groceries based on what I actually wanted to eat, not meals designed to impress his business associates. I reorganized our home office to suit my work style instead of Austin's preferences. I even changed our internet provider to one Austin had previously vetoed. Each independent decision built confidence for larger choices. By the end of the second week, I was making strategic business decisions, setting my own schedule, and planning my future without considering Austin's imaginary input. The strangest part of this adaptation was discovering preferences I'd forgotten I had. Without Austin's constant guidance toward his choices, I rediscovered that I actually preferred morning meetings to afternoon ones, that I worked better with classical music than silence, and that I was much more decisive than I'd believed. Austin had convinced me I needed his management to function professionally. Instead, I discovered that his management had been hindering my natural capabilities. But the real test of my newfound independence was coming. Austin would eventually return from Italy, and I had to be ready to face him as the strong, independent woman I was becoming, not the dependent wife he'd abandoned. 3 weeks into my campaign against Austin, I was no longer just surviving his betrayal. I was thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible. The business that Austin had convinced me was dependent on his management was flourishing under my direct control. More importantly, I was discovering capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. My first major breakthrough came when Bill Morrison called with an opportunity that would have been impossible under Austin's management. Pinnacle Property Group had been selected to develop a controversial mixed-use project downtown, and they needed crisis communications expertise to navigate public opposition and environmental concerns. "This is exactly the kind of challenge you excel at," Bill told me during our strategy meeting. "The city council is divided, community groups are mobilizing, and the environmental impact study has raised questions we need to address proactively." Under Austin's system, this would have been the type of project he'd take the lead on, positioning himself as the primary strategist while relegating me to writing press releases. Now I was designing the entire approach myself, and the difference was remarkable. I spent 2 days conducting stakeholder analysis, identifying every group that might oppose the project and understanding their specific concerns. Instead of the generic crisis management playbook Austin typically relied on, I developed a customized strategy that addressed legitimate community concerns while highlighting the project's benefits. The presentation I delivered to Pinnacle's board was unlike anything I'd done under Austin's oversight. Without his helpful input, my natural strategic thinking emerged clearly. I proposed a phased communication approach that would turn potential opponents into collaborative partners by incorporating their feedback into the development process. "This is brilliant," the board chairman said after my presentation. "You've identified solutions we hadn't considered. How quickly can you implement this strategy?" The contract they offered was worth $85,000 over 6 months, more than Austin had typically negotiated for similar projects. But more valuable than the money was the validation of my independent capabilities. Similar success came with my other clients. Ron Martinez at Summit Development asked me to handle media strategy for their entire portfolio of projects, not just individual campaigns. Taylor and Associates requested my help expanding into crisis communications, offering to retain my services as a strategic consultant for their growing client base. Within a month of cutting Austin out of my business operations, my revenue had increased by 40%. Clients were more engaged, projects were more challenging, and my professional reputation was expanding beyond Austin's limited network. The success gave me confidence to pursue opportunities Austin had always discouraged. I applied to speak at the Rocky Mountain Crisis Communications Conference, something Austin had previously dismissed as too small to be worth your time. When the conference organizers accepted my proposal, I realized Austin's judgment had been systematically wrong about my professional prospects. But the most significant foundation I was building was personal independence. Living alone in our house had initially felt haunting, but I gradually transformed the space to reflect my own preferences rather than Austin's controlling influence. I started with his home office, the room where he'd conducted fraudulent business, on my behalf. Instead of preserving it as a shrine to his deception, I converted it into a proper workspace for my growing consultancy. I replaced Austin's heavy mahogany desk with a standing workspace that suited my creative process. I removed his collection of business award plaques, awards I now realized had been partly earned through my uncredited work, and hung my journalism school diploma and professional certifications instead. The bedroom came next. I couldn't continue sleeping on the living room couch indefinitely, but the space we'd shared felt contaminated by Austin's betrayal. My solution was complete redecoration. I donated the furniture Austin had chosen, painted the walls in colors I actually preferred, and created a space that belonged entirely to me. These physical changes reflected deeper psychological transformation. For 3 years, I'd adapted my preferences to Austin's vision of our shared life. Now I was rediscovering my own taste, my own values, my own vision for my future. I also began rebuilding social connections Austin had systematically severed. My first call was to Taylor in Portland, apologizing for years of canceled plans and missed opportunities. "I know I've been a terrible friend," I told her during a long phone conversation. "Austin always seemed to have reasons why I couldn't join things, and I let him convince me that work should come first." "Gracie, you don't need to apologize," Taylor said. I could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help. "Are you okay now?" Explaining Austin's deception to Taylor was difficult, but necessary. She listened with growing outrage as I described the scope of his manipulation and the legal action I was taking against him. "That bastard," she said when I finished. "Gracie, I'm so proud of you for fighting back. Do you need anything? Support? References? Someone to just listen when things get overwhelming?" Taylor's unconditional support reminded me what healthy relationships felt like. She didn't judge me for being deceived or question my decisions about fighting Austin. She simply offered help and celebrated my growing independence. Similar conversations with my college friends and former journalism colleagues revealed how much Austin had isolated me from people who actually cared about my well-being. These relationships, temporarily damaged by Austin's manipulation, began healing as I took responsibility for my absence and committed to rebuilding connections. The most important foundation I was building was financial independence. With Pierre's help, I established completely separate banking, investment, and retirement accounts. For the first time in 3 years, I had money that Austin couldn't access or monitor. "You're in a remarkably strong position," Marjorie Chen told me during one of our business consultations. "Your client base is solid, your reputation is excellent, and your profit margins are improving without Austin's overhead costs. You're building something sustainable here." She was right. Austin had convinced me that I needed his support to succeed professionally. Instead, I was discovering that his involvement had been limiting my potential. Every aspect of my business was stronger without his helpful management. By the end of my first month of independence, I felt like a different person. The anxious, dependent woman Austin had been planning to imprison was gone, replaced by someone confident, capable, and increasingly powerful. Austin's greatest mistake had been underestimating my resilience. Now I was becoming everything he'd tried to prevent me from being. 6 weeks after Austin's abandonment, I received the phone call that would change everything. Pierre's voice was barely contained excitement when he reached me at my newly reorganized home office. "Gracie, you need to sit down. The FBI wants to meet with us tomorrow morning." My heart started racing. The FBI? Why? Remember how Austin had been collecting compromising information about your clients? It turns out he wasn't just planning to use it for business leverage. The federal investigation into political corruption in Denver real estate development has identified Austin as a person of interest. The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. Austin's obsessive research into my clients' personal lives, his cultivation of relationships with city planning officials, his sudden interest in projects involving public land use. It hadn't been business strategy. It had been preparation for something much more lucrative and illegal. "They've been monitoring suspicious financial transactions between development companies and city officials," Pierre continued. "Austin's name appeared in connection with several payments that don't match any legitimate business services." The meeting with FBI Special Agent Sandra Mills took place in Pierre's conference room the next morning. Agent Mills was a slight woman with sharp eyes who got straight to the point. "Mrs. Richardson, we believe your husband has been using your business as a front for political bribery. Your legitimate consulting work provided perfect cover for payments to city officials who influenced development approvals." She spread photographs. Across the table, pictures of Austin meeting with people I didn't recognize, entering city buildings, exchanging envelopes in parking garages. The surveillance images painted a picture of criminal activity I'd been completely unaware of. "Your clients were unknowing participants," Agent Mills explained. "Austin would bill them for your legitimate consulting services, then use those payments to make additional transactions with corrupt officials. Your business reputation gave him credibility he never could have achieved independently." The scope of Austin's scheme was breathtaking. He'd been using my professional relationships to facilitate corruption involving millions of dollars in development projects. The blackmail material he'd collected wasn't just for personal leverage. It was insurance against clients discovering his illegal activities. "We need your cooperation," Agent Mills said. "You have access to financial records and communications that could help us prosecute not just Austin, but the entire corruption network he was part of." I thought about my clients, honest business executives who'd trusted Richardson Communications to help them navigate legitimate regulatory challenges. Austin had turned their good faith into criminal conspiracy without their knowledge. "What do you need from me?" Agent Mills smiled. "Everything. Every document, every email, every financial record you can provide. Your husband thought he was using your business to protect himself. Instead, he created the perfect evidence trail to convict him." Over the next week, I worked closely with the FBI to understand the full scope of Austin's criminal network. What I discovered was stunning in its sophistication and scope. Austin had identified development projects where environmental or zoning approvals were uncertain, then approached city officials with offers to facilitate favorable decisions. He'd use my business as a conduit for payments, disguising bribes as consulting fees for services my company never actually provided. The genius of his scheme was how it exploited my reputation. City officials trusted that payments from Richardson Communications were legitimate because my business had an established track record of ethical consulting work. My good name had been his criminal shield. "Your husband generated approximately $2.3 million in illegal payments over 18 months, Agent Mills told me during one of our sessions. He kept detailed records because he thought they proved legitimate business activity. Instead, they provide perfect evidence of systematic corruption. But Austin's downfall had been his greed and impatience. The Italy trip wasn't just about pursuing his online romance, it was his exit strategy. Federal investigators had been closing in on the corruption network, and Austin had realized he needed to escape before indictments were issued. He probably planned to liquidate your business assets and disappear permanently, Agent Mills explained. The hospital abandonment gave him the perfect cover story. He could claim you'd suffered a mental breakdown and needed to be relocated for treatment while he cleaned out your accounts. Instead, his abandonment had given federal investigators access to evidence they'd been struggling to obtain. By leaving me alone with our shared digital life, Austin had handed law enforcement everything they needed to destroy his criminal network. The breakthrough moment came when Agent Mills showed me bank routing information that proved Austin had been stealing from my business for far longer than I'd realized. The federal investigation had uncovered financial records I'd never seen, documenting systematic theft dating back to the beginning of our marriage. He wasn't just using your business for recent corruption, she said. He's been embezzling from your accounts almost from the day you got married. The total amount approaches $400,000. $400,000. Austin had stolen nearly $500,000 from me while convincing me I was financially dependent on his support. The money had funded his double life, his criminal activities, and his preparation for abandoning E. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Mills explained the scope of the federal case. Austin wasn't a minor player in a small corruption scheme. He was a central figure in a network that had influenced millions of dollars in development decisions across 3 states. Your husband was planning to testify against other conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence, Agent Mills told me. That's another reason he needed to relocate you to Los Angeles. Federal witnesses often have to move their families for protection. Austin had been preparing to enter witness protection, taking me with him under the guise of my mental health treatment. I would have been relocated against my will, isolated from any support system, and forced to live under a new identity, while Austin served a minimal sentence for cooperating with prosecutors. He never intended to protect you, Agent Mills said grimly. He intended to use you as cover for his own survival. But Austin's plan had a fatal flaw. By abandoning me before the federal investigation concluded, he'd lost his only leverage with prosecutors. Without a family to relocate and protect, Austin was just another criminal facing decades in prison. The indictments will be unsealed tomorrow, Agent Mills told me as our meeting concluded. Austin Richardson will be arrested the moment he returns to U.S. soil. And Mrs. Richardson, you're going to be our star witness. Austin thought he'd been using my success to protect his crimes. Instead, he'd created the evidence that would destroy him completely. The federal investigation transformed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. What began as a personal quest for justice against Austin became my participation in exposing a corruption network that had influenced Denver's development landscape for years. But with this new role came challenges that tested everything I'd rebuilt since Austin's abandonment. Agent Mills contacted me 3 days after our initial meeting with urgent news. Austin is trying to return to the United States, she told me. Over the phone. He's booked a flight from Rome to Denver arriving tomorrow afternoon. We need to accelerate our timeline. My stomach dropped. I wasn't ready to face Austin yet. Despite 6 weeks of building independence and strength, the thought of seeing him again triggered panic I thought I'd overcome. What does this mean for the investigation? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It means we arrest him at the airport and you become even more crucial to our case. Austin will likely try to contact you once he's in custody. We need you to be prepared for that conversation. Pierre joined me at the FBI field office the next morning for a briefing that would prepare me for Austin's return. The conference room felt surreal. Federal agents explaining how my husband's arrest would unfold while I tried to process that the man I'd once loved was now a fugitive returning to face multiple felony charges. Austin doesn't know about the federal investigation, Agent Mills explained. He thinks he's returning to deal with your divorce proceedings and the civil fraud allegations. When he's arrested, he'll be completely blindsided. The irony wasn't lost on me. Austin had spent months planning to blindside me with his abandonment and imprisonment scheme. Now he was walking into a trap he never saw coming. But the FBI's plan required my active participation in ways that challenged my newfound strength. They wanted me to visit Austin in federal detention and wear a recording device during our conversation. "He'll try to manipulate you," Agent Mills warned. "He'll claim everything was a misunderstanding, that he was protecting you, that the federal charges are based on false information. We need you to let him talk while we record his admissions." The thought of facing Austin while secretly recording him felt like a betrayal of everything I'd rebuilt. For 6 weeks, I'd been establishing authentic relationships and honest communication. Now I was being asked to engage in the kind of deception Austin had specialized in. Pierre sensed my hesitation. "Gracie, this isn't about becoming like Austin. This is about ensuring he faces consequences for what he's done to you and others. Your participation could prevent him from manipulating other victims." That perspective helped, but it didn't eliminate my anxiety about seeing Austin again. Despite everything I'd discovered about his betrayal, part of me still remembered the man I'd thought I'd married. Would I be strong enough to maintain my resolve when faced with his charm and manipulation? The test came sooner than expected. Austin was arrested at Denver International Airport at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, his attorney had arranged for him to call me from federal detention. I was in my home office when the phone rang, working on a crisis communication strategy for a client dealing with regulatory scrutiny. The irony of that timing wasn't lost on me. "Gracie?" Austin's voice sounded smaller than I remembered, uncertain in a way that was completely foreign to the confident man who'd abandoned me. "Thank God you answered. I don't understand what's happening. They're saying I've committed federal crimes. But this is all a mistake." Hearing his voice triggered a complex mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, but also an unexpected pang of loss for the relationship I'd thought we'd had. I had to remind myself that the loving husband I mourned had never actually existed. "Where have you been, Austin?" I asked, following the script Agent Mills had provided. "You left me at the hospital and disappeared for 2 months." I know, and I'm so sorry about that. I was confused, scared about our marriage, and I made a terrible mistake. But Gracie, these federal charges are insane. They're saying I was involved in political corruption, that I was using your business for illegal activities. His denial was so complete, so convincing, that I almost questioned what I'd learned about his crimes. This was Austin's greatest talent, making his victims doubt their own perceptions even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. "I've seen the financial records, Austin. I know about the payments to city officials, the bribes disguised as consulting fees. Those weren't bribes." His voice took on the reasonable, explanatory tone I remembered from our marriage. "Those were legitimate consulting arrangements. Some of the work was confidential, which is why I didn't involve you directly. I was trying to protect you from potential liability." Even now, facing federal charges, Austin was trying to position his criminal activity as protection for me. The manipulation was so reflexive, so automatic, that I wondered if he even recognized he was doing it. Protect me by using my business license to commit crimes without my knowledge? "Gracie, you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this, to hurt you. Everything I did was to build a better future for us. The FBI is twisting legitimate business activities to look criminal." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Austin alternating between denials, explanations, and attempts to manipulate me into believing his version of events. Throughout it all, the recording device captured every word, every attempt at gaslighting, every lie. When I finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely empowered. Austin's manipulation had no effect on me anymore. I could hear his techniques clearly now, recognize his patterns, understand how he'd controlled me for so long. Agent Mills reviewed the recording with satisfaction. "This is exactly what we needed. Austin just denied knowledge of activities we have documented evidence he orchestrated. His attempts to manipulate you into supporting his version of events will help establish his pattern of deception. But the real test of my transformation came that evening when Austin's mother called. Margaret Richardson had always been critical of me, never believing I was good enough for her successful son. Now she was demanding I recant my cooperation with federal investigators. "You're destroying my son's life out of spite," she accused. "Austin made a mistake leaving you at the hospital, but this vindictive campaign has gone too far." The old me would have wilted under Margaret's criticism, would have questioned whether I was being too harsh on Austin. But the woman I'd become responded with calm certainty. "Margaret, your son committed multiple felonies. He stole from my business, committed identity fraud, and participated in political corruption. He's facing consequences for his choices, not my vindictiveness. He was trying to build a good life for both of you. He was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and imprisoned in a psychiatric facility so he could steal my business. That's not building a life together. That's destroying mine for his benefit." Margaret hung up on me, but I felt only relief. Austin's family had always made me feel inadequate, unworthy of their son's attention. Now I understood that their golden boy was a criminal, and their criticism carried no weight with me anymore. The challenges were far from over, but each test only confirmed that the woman Austin had abandoned was gone forever. 4 months after Austin's arrest, his federal trial was approaching, and I was preparing for the most difficult confrontation of my life. Not just testifying against him in court, but facing the man who had systematically destroyed every aspect of my trust and independence. Pierre and Agent Mills had spent weeks preparing me for this moment, but nothing could really ready me for seeing Austin again in person. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver felt imposing as I walked through security on the morning I was scheduled to testify. Pierre accompanied me, carrying folders of evidence that would support my testimony. After months of phone calls and recorded conversations, I was finally going to face Austin directly and tell the truth about what he'd done. "Remember," Pierre said as we waited in the witness preparation room, "you're not the same woman he abandoned at the hospital. You've rebuilt your business, exposed his crimes, and helped federal investigators dismantle an entire corruption network. He has no power over you anymore." But when the bailiff called my name and I walked into the courtroom, seeing Austin at the defendant's table still hit me like a physical blow. He looked smaller than I remembered, wearing an ill-fitting suit and an expression of defeat I'd never seen before. For a moment, the man I'd once loved was visible beneath the criminal he'd become. Austin's eyes met mine as I was sworn in, and I saw a flicker of the old manipulation, a look that said, "Remember us, remember what we had, remember that you once loved me." But instead of the doubt and confusion I'd felt during our phone conversation, I felt only cold clarity. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen, began my testimony by establishing my credentials and the scope of Richardson Communications. As I described my business and professional background, I could see Austin's defense attorney preparing to attack my credibility. "Mrs. Richardson," Prosecutor Chen continued, "can you tell the court about your marriage to the defendant and how he became involved in your business?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. In clear, measured tones, I described how Austin had systematically inserted himself into my business operations, while convincing me I was incapable of managing them independently. I explained how he'd used my credentials to establish relationships with clients, then exploited those relationships to facilitate corruption. "At any point, did you authorize Mr. Richardson to use your business license to accept payments for services your company didn't provide?" "Never." I was completely unaware that Austin was using Richardson Communications as a front for illegal activities. He convinced me that I was doing simple freelance work while he handled all client communications and business management. Austin's defense attorney, an expensive-looking man named Bradley Stone, objected frequently during my testimony, trying to characterize Austin's actions as legitimate business practices that I'd simply misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, email chains, Recorded conversations where Austin had clearly admitted to activities I'd never authorized. The most difficult part of my testimony came when Prosecutor Chen asked me to describe Austin's abandonment and the discovery of his crimes. "Mrs. Richardson, can you tell the court what happened on the day of your surgery?" I took a deep breath and recounted that terrible morning. Austin's distraction during my medical crisis, his use of my phone to send deceptive messages while I was unconscious, his departure for Italy while I was still in recovery. The courtroom was completely silent as I described waking up alone and gradually discovering the scope of his betrayal. "And what did you discover about Mr. Richardson's plans for your future?" This was the moment that would destroy any sympathy Austin might have earned from the jury. I described the evidence I'd found about his coordination with the LA firm, his plans to have me declared mentally incompetent, his preparation to imprison me in a psychiatric facility while he sold my business and entered witness protection. Several jurors looked visibly shocked. Austin's own attorney seemed surprised by the scope of his client's betrayal. Apparently, Austin hadn't shared the full extent of his scheme even with his legal counsel. During cross-examination, Bradley Stone tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge against her estranged husband, but 4 months of FBI cooperation had prepared me for these attacks. "Mrs. Richardson, isn't it true that you were angry about your husband's affair and used these federal charges to punish him?" "Mr. Stone, I discovered Austin's criminal activities before I knew about his affairs. My cooperation with federal investigators is based on evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption, not personal grievances." "But you stand to benefit financially from Mr. Richardson's conviction, don't you?" "I stand to recover assets that were stolen from me through identity fraud and embezzlement. That's restitution for crimes committed against me, not profit from revenge." Stone's attempts to discredit me only highlighted the strength of the case against Austin. Every question he asked gave me another opportunity to describe Austin's systematic deception and criminal activity. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when Prosecutor Chen asked me to describe the impact of Austin's crimes on my life. For 3 years, I believed I was in a loving marriage with a supportive partner. Instead, I was being systematically deceived, isolated, and prepared for imprisonment by someone who was stealing my professional success to facilitate political corruption. Austin didn't just commit crimes against the city of Denver. He committed crimes against me personally, using my trust and love as weapons against my own freedom. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt a weight I'd been carrying for months finally lift from my shoulders. I had told the truth, completely and publicly, about what Austin had done. There was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation, no chance that his manipulation could work on me again. But Austin wasn't finished. As I walked past the defendant's table toward the courtroom exit, he leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgent. Stone immediately requested a brief recess. "Mrs. Richardson," Stone approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "My client would like to speak with you privately. He says he has information that might help both of you." Pierre shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. Austin has nothing to offer except more manipulation." But I surprised myself by agreeing to the meeting. Not because I believed Austin had anything valuable to share, but because I wanted to see him try his manipulation one final time, knowing it would have no effect on me. The meeting took place in a small conference room with Pierre, Stone, and a federal marshal present. Austin looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete defeat mixed with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Gracie," he said quietly, "I know I can never undo what I've done to you, but I want you to know that leaving you at the hospital was the worst mistake of my life. Not because I got caught, but because it showed me what kind of person I'd become." I looked at this man who had once controlled every aspect of my life, who had planned to imprison me for his own benefit, who had stolen my success and tried to destroy my future, and I felt nothing but indifference. "Austin," I said calmly. The worst mistake of your life was thinking I'd never be strong enough to discover what you'd done. Everything else was just the inevitable consequence of that miscalculation. It was the last conversation we would ever have. And for the first time in our entire relationship, I had the last word. 6 months after Austin's conviction on 12 federal felony counts, I stood at the window of my new office overlooking downtown Denver, watching a private jet taxi toward the terminal at the regional airport. The sight would have seemed impossible a year ago, when I was a woman stranded in a hospital bed, abandoned by the man she trusted most. Now, that jet carried my attorney and the final documents that would close the most transformative chapter of my life. Austin had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The judge had been particularly harsh about his abuse of trust, noting that he'd systematically exploited his wife's professional reputation to facilitate corruption while planning her imprisonment for his own benefit. The courtroom had been packed with other victims of the corruption network Austin had helped operate. But more satisfying than Austin's prison sentence was what I'd built from the ashes of his betrayal. Richardson Communications had grown into one of Denver's premier crisis management firms, with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. The woman who'd once been convinced she needed her husband's management to function professionally was now running a multi-million-dollar consultancy, Pierre. Dubois stepped into my office carrying a leather portfolio that contained the final pieces of my legal victory over Austin. "The asset recovery is complete," he announced with satisfaction, "between the criminal restitution order and the civil judgment. You've recovered $1.7 million in stolen assets plus interest and penalties. Nearly $2 million. Austin had stolen from me systematically for 3 years, but the federal investigation had uncovered accounts and investments I'd never known existed. His criminal activities had been profitable, but not profitable enough to compensate for his eventual downfall." "What about the house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yours completely, with a clear title. The mortgage that Austin fraudulently refinanced has been voided, and you own the property, free and clear." Pierre smiled. "Of course, I understand you're not planning to keep it." He was right. I'd already accepted an offer on the Cherry Creek house where Austin had deceived me for 3 years. Every room in that place contained memories of his manipulation, and no amount of redecorating could cleanse the psychological contamination. The sale would close next week, netting me enough to purchase the downtown loft I'd been renovating as both my residence and expanded office space. But the most important resolution hadn't been financial or legal. It had been personal. The private jet at the airport carried someone who represented the future I was building, rather than the past I was escaping. Agent Mills knocked on my office door, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal warmth. Over the months of working together, she'd become more than a federal contact. She'd become a friend who'd witnessed my transformation from victim to victor. "The corruption investigation is officially closed," she reported. "Austin's testimony helped us convict 6 city officials and 4 other business operators. The total impact of the network you helped us expose was over $12 million in fraudulent contracts and bribes. $12 million in corruption that had influenced Denver's development for years. Austin had been a central figure in a conspiracy that had affected thousands of residents through manipulated zoning decisions and fraudulent contracts. My decision to cooperate with federal investigators hadn't just recovered my stolen assets. It had helped clean up an entire system. "There's something else," Agent Mills continued. "The FBI director wants to present you with a Citizens Award for your cooperation in the investigation. Your willingness to wear recording devices and testify against Austin provided crucial evidence we couldn't have obtained otherwise." An award from the FBI. The woman Austin had planned to have declared mentally incompetent was being honored by federal law enforcement for her courage and competence. The irony was so perfect, I almost laughed. My phone buzzed with a text message. That made me smile. Taylor, my friend from Portland, was confirming her flight details for tomorrow's celebration. After 3 years of isolation engineered by Austin, I'd rebuilt a network of genuine friendships with people who supported my success rather than trying to control it. The celebration wasn't just for my legal victory. It was for the launch of Richardson Communications' new division specializing in helping abuse survivors rebuild their professional lives. Working with Agent Mills had introduced me to other women who'd been exploited by manipulative partners, and I'd discovered my skills in crisis communications translated perfectly to helping victims navigate the legal and business challenges of escaping control. "You've created something remarkable here," Agent Mills said, gesturing toward the office where my team was preparing presentations for new clients. "Austin thought he was using your abilities to protect his crimes. Instead, he accidentally created the foundation for something much more important." She was right. Without Austin's systematic fraud, I never would have discovered my own capabilities or built the independence that now defined my life. His betrayal had been the catalyst for a transformation I could never have achieved while constrained by his manipulation. But the day's most significant moment came when my assistant announced that Bill Morrison from Pinnacle Property Group was on the line with news about our latest project. "Gracie," Bill said when I picked up the phone, "the City Council approved the Riverside Commons development unanimously. Your crisis communication strategy turned every potential opponent into a supporter. The project you managed has become the model for how development should be done in Denver." Riverside Commons had been the controversial project that launched my independent consulting career. Under Austin's management, it would have been handled with his typical approach of behind-the-scenes manipulation and potential corruption. Instead, I'd used transparent communication and genuine community engagement to build support for responsible development. "There's more," Bill continued. "3 other cities have contacted us about hiring Richardson Communications for similar projects. Your approach to ethical development consulting is attracting attention nationally." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.